Sometimes the most powerful love doesn't come to rescue you. It comes to remind you that you were never too broken to be chosen. The story you are about to hear is not about riches or fame. It is about emptiness, redemption, and the kind of love that heals wounds money cannot touch. Lennox Vale was a name people whispered with awe and fear. At 35, he was already among the world's most powerful billionaires, owner of Vale Global, a company that controlled resorts, airlines, and private estates from Monaco to Dubai. On the cover of magazines, he was the picture of confidence. Tall, razor-sharp suits, storm gray eyes that seemed to know too much. To outsiders, he was the man who had it all. But Lennox knew the truth. He had everything and nothing. Women adored him, models, heiresses, even Hollywood stars. They all tried, and they all failed. The tabloids called him the untouchable tycoon. In private, people whispered that no woman had ever satisfied him, not because of arrogance, but because he could never feel what they pretended to offer. Every relationship ended the same quickly, without explanation. He left them behind like shadows that never reached his soul. He had built an empire, but his heart was a desert. And then came the night that would change everything. He didn't want to be there. The annual Carter Foundation Scholarship Banquet was small compared to the dazzling galas he usually attended. It was held in a church hall, with folding chairs, paper name tags, and students who dreamed of changing the world. His assistant convinced him to attend as the keynote speaker, arguing it would soften his image. Lennox walked in prepared to leave before dessert. His plan was simple: shake hands, make a donation, give a polished speech about opportunity, and disappear. But destiny had other plans. She walked in quietly, unnoticed at first. No glittering gown, no designer jewelry, no dramatic entrance, just a simple navy dress, a notebook pressed to her chest, and eyes that did not waver when they met his. Her name was Elena Carter, daughter of a small-town pastor and the very student the foundation had been created to honor. Unlike the others, she did not rush to meet him. She didn't smile to impress him or lower her voice in awe. Instead, she carried herself with a grace that felt unshakable. For the first time in years, Lennox felt seen, not for his power, not for his wealth, but for something he himself had forgotten existed. After the speeches, he found himself searching the crowd not for investors or politicians but for her. She was standing by the refreshment table, pouring coffee for an elderly professor. "You're different," Lennox said without thinking when he finally approached. She looked at him calmly. "Different from what?" "From everyone else in this room." Elena tilted her head slightly. "Maybe it's not me. Maybe you've just been looking at the wrong rooms." No woman had ever spoken to him like that. Not with defiance, not with quiet truth. And in that moment, Lennox Vale, the billionaire who conquered the world, but never found peace, felt the ground shift. Beneath him, that night, he went home unsettled. For years, he had been the storm everyone else tried to chase. But now, for the first time, he found himself chasing the calm in someone else's presence. And though he didn't know it yet, Elena Carter wasn't just going to enter his life. She was going to rewrite it. The days after the banquet felt strangely different for Lennox. He returned to his glass-walled office high above the city, surrounded by power, noise, and the endless rhythm of deals being made. But the echo of her words, "Maybe you've just been looking at the wrong rooms," would not leave him. He tried to drown it out with work, with numbers, with voices that only spoke in profit margins and percentages. Yet her voice cut through it all, quiet but unforgettable. He had met countless women. They smiled at him like he was the prize, the ultimate conquest. But Elena Carter, she looked at him as though she saw through the armor, as though she noticed the silence inside the man everyone thought had everything. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. On the third day after the banquet, he found himself dialing the number of the Carter Foundation. He told himself it was business, another donation, another tax deduction. But when the receptionist transferred him to Elena, his pulse shifted in a way he had not felt in years. Her voice came soft, calm, but steady. "Mr. Vale, this is unexpected. How can I help you?" For a moment, he forgot the polished line he had prepared. "I was wondering if you would join me for dinner, just to talk." There was a pause. long enough for him to imagine her considering not just the invitation, but the man behind it. Then she said, "I don't think a dinner with me would be the kind of conversation you're used to. That should have annoyed him. Most people rushed at the chance to be near him, but instead, he felt something rare, curiosity. That's exactly why I asked." When she finally agreed, it wasn't to one of his penthouse suites or his five-star restaurants. She chose a small diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place where truck drivers stopped for black coffee and pies that tasted like home. Lennox arrived in his tailored suit, the kind worth more than the entire monthly income of the diner. He looked out of place, and for once, he felt it too. She was already there, seated in a corner booth with a journal open beside her. No jewelry, no makeup beyond a natural simplicity, just herself. And when she looked up, she didn't see the billionaire everyone else admired or envied. She saw a man who was learning, slowly, that wealth couldn't fill a hollow heart. They talked. At first, it was small things: school, travel, books. But slowly the conversation turned, like rivers always finding the sea. He asked her why she wanted to be a teacher instead of chasing careers that paid far more. Her answer was disarming. "Because the world doesn't need more rich people, Lennox. It needs more people who remind others that they matter." Her words lingered in the air like a quiet truth. He had never thought of life that way. He built empires to matter, to prove something to himself and to the world. But she was saying it differently. That value wasn't measured in ownership or control, but in how deeply you touched another soul. That night, when he returned to his penthouse, the silence of the marble floors felt heavier than usual. The city glittered beneath him, but he found himself staring at the empty space beside him, wondering what it would feel like if her laughter filled the room. The next weeks unfolded like a series of tests he hadn't signed up for. He invited her into his world charity events, business dinners, luxury retreats. But Elena never let herself be dazzled. She walked through his circles with calm grace, unimpressed by wealth and unshaken by power. When people whispered about her plain dresses or modest ways, she didn't flinch. She smiled and spoke to everyone with the same respect, whether they were a CEO or a waiter carrying trays. That, more than anything, caught Lennox off guard. He was used to people performing around him, trying to impress. Elena had no such performance. She was whole without trying. And slowly, something began to shift. For years, he had been known as the man no woman could keep, the storm that left others burned. But around Elena, he found himself slowing down, listening more, speaking less. Even his closest advisors noticed the change. "You're distracted," one of them told him. But it wasn't distraction. It was awakening. Still, the hook of his old world pulled at him. There were whispers in boardrooms and gossip in magazines. Why her? Why a pastor's daughter when he could have anyone? The rumors reached him. But worse, they reached her. Elena heard the questions, the mockery, the doubts whispered behind her back. Yet she never confronted him about it. One evening, he asked her, "Do the voices bother you?" She closed her notebook and looked at him with eyes that carried both gentleness and strength. "I don't live for their voices, and neither should you." It hit him deeper than he wanted to admit. All his life, he had been running, trying to prove something, trying to silence the echo of loneliness with applause, money, power. But she was showing him another way, that real strength came not from conquering others, but from standing in peace with yourself. The hook of this chapter was not in her beauty, though she was beautiful. It was not in her humility, though it humbled him. It was in the unshakable truth she carried. She reminded him he was not too broken to be chosen. And as he looked at her that night across the diner table, her hand resting calmly over her journal, Lennox veiled a man who had never stayed, never been satisfied, never been healed, knew that his life was no longer his own. Something had begun, something he could not control, something that felt both terrifying and liberating. And deep down, he feared it and longed for it all at once. The more Lennox tried to understand what was happening inside him, the more it unsettled him. He had never allowed anyone to get this close before, not truly. People wanted his wealth, his name, his power, and when they looked at him, they saw only what he could give them. Elena was the first to look at him like he was already enough without the empire. without the shadows of his past. That terrified him as much as it comforted him. In business, he was in control of everything: contracts, acquisitions, entire industries bending to his decisions. But with her, he felt stripped of the armor that had always protected him. Round Elena, he wasn't Lennox Vale, the billionaire. He was simply a man who wanted to be known. Though he barely knew himself, he began to search for reasons to see her more often. Not grand gestures, not the kind of lavish gifts that usually spoke for him. Instead, it was simple things: walking her home after her evening classes, sitting with her in quiet cafes where no one cared who he was, listening as she talked about her students, her dreams, the little joys she found in ordinary life. And the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how extraordinary ordinary could be when you shared it with the right soul. But nothing in his life had ever come without opposition. His world began to notice the change. Board members questioned his focus. Friends whispered behind his back. Tabloids began printing her picture next to his, calling her the unlikely woman or the pastor's daughter who captured the king. Some made it sound like a scandal, as though her humility was an insult to his empire. One afternoon, his closest advisor confronted him directly. "This isn't you, Lennox. She doesn't belong in this world. You'll ruin yourself, chasing something that doesn't make sense." Lennox's reply was quiet, but it carried more weight than any deal he had ever signed. "Maybe I'm tired of a world that makes sense but leaves me empty." That night, he found Elena at the same diner where they had first met for coffee. She was sitting by the window, writing in her journal. For a long moment, he just watched her from the doorway unnoticed, wondering how someone so gentle could carry such strength. When he finally joined her, he told her about the doubts, the voices, the criticism. Her response was simple: "Do you believe them, or do you believe yourself?" "I don't know who I am without all this," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've been chasing something for so long. I'm not sure I'd even recognize myself if I stopped running." Elena closed her journal and looked at him, her eyes steady and unafraid. "Then maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to be still long enough to see what was always there." Those words pierced him deeper than any rival ever had. Stillness was not a luxury he had ever allowed himself. His life had been motion, constant and unrelenting. But with her, he felt the quiet could heal him. And that possibility frightened him, because healing meant facing wounds he had buried for too long. The turning point came one evening when he invited her to one of his charity galas. She agreed reluctantly, saying she didn't belong in those glittering halls. But when she arrived, she carried herself with the same grace as always: modest dress, calm presence, unshaken by the chandeliers or the cameras flashing in every corner. He watched as she spoke with waiters, musicians, even the security guards, giving them the same attention she would have given a king. The room noticed. Some admired her, but others sneered, whispering behind champagne glasses that she wasn't polished enough, wasn't glamorous enough, wasn't enough. When one woman, bold in her cruelty, remarked loud enough for Elena to hear, "She doesn't fit. She'll never fit," Lennox felt an anger rise in him that no business deal had ever stirred. He wanted to silence them all, to remind them who he was, to remind them of his power. But before he could speak, Elena placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "They don't define me, and they don't define you." That moment struck him harder than the insult itself. She wasn't wounded by their judgment. She was above it, steady and whole. And for the first time, he realized he had spent his life trying to be enough for everyone else, when the only person he had never learned to be enough for was himself. Later, that night, when the gala ended and the glittering crowd dispersed, he drove her home in silence. Outside her apartment building, she turned to him. "Lennox, I need you to understand something. I can't be another trophy in your collection. I can't be a story you tell for a season and then walk away from. If you want me in your life, you have to decide if you're willing to let go of the parts of yourself that keep you empty." Her words stayed with him long after she disappeared into the stairwell. He sat in his car for hours, staring at the darkened street, realizing she was right. Every woman before her had been an escape. Elena was not an escape, she was a mirror. And mirrors show you not what you want to see, but what you need to face. That night, Lennox Vale, the man who had always walked away before, made a silent vow. He would not walk away this time, not because she demanded it, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to be more than what the world said he was. He wanted to be worthy of the way she saw him. What he did not know was that this decision would come with a cost, because when love begins to heal, the wounds it touches do not stay silent. They cry out, they resist, they demand to be faced. And soon, the life he had built would be tested in ways he had never imagined. And as he closed his eyes that night, her words echoed in him like a seed planted deep in dry soil, waiting for rain. If you want me in your life, you have to let go of the parts of yourself that keep you empty. He didn't know if he could, but he knew he had to try. He had promised himself he wouldn't walk away. But promises are easy when the night is quiet and the world feels far away. The true test comes in the daylight, when voices rise, when pressure mounts, when the old life claws back to reclaim what you're trying to leave behind. For Lennox Vale, the storm came faster than he expected. Word of his connection with Elena spread beyond whispers. Newspapers printed her picture beside his, painting her as the outsider in a world of diamonds and privilege. Business rivals seized the story, mocking him in boardrooms, calling him distracted, weak, reckless. To them, love was not strength, it was vulnerability. And in their world, vulnerability was dangerous. But the fiercest storm did not come from the world outside. It came from within. For the first time in his life, Lennox found himself at war with himself. Part of him wanted to protect Elena from the scrutiny, to shield her with the walls of his empire. But another part of him feared she would slip away, not because of others, but because she would one day see him for what he truly was, a man who had everything, and still felt empty. Elena noticed the change. She saw it in the way his voice tightened when he spoke, in the restless pacing of his steps, in the way he stared at the skyline, as though searching for answers he couldn't find. One evening, when they sat together on a park bench watching children chase kites in the fading light, she asked him quietly, "Why do you look at the world like it's slipping through your fingers?" He hesitated before answering, "Because it is. I've built everything by control. But with you, I can't control what happens, and that terrifies me." Her gaze didn't waver. "You don't need to control love, Lennox. You need to trust it. If you spend your life gripping it with fear, you'll crush the very thing you're trying to hold." Her words sank into him like stones falling into deep water, sending ripples through places he hadn't touched in years. Trust. It was something he had never practiced, not with family, not with friends, not with anyone. His empire thrived because he trusted no one. But love demanded something different. Love demanded surrender. The following week stretched him further than any boardroom ever had. He brought Elena into his world more openly, introducing her to colleagues, to events, to places he once reserved only for power. Each time, he watched how she carried herself, not with pride, not with arrogance, but with humility and quiet courage. Yet every step forward seemed to tighten the opposition. Investors questioned his judgment. Partners hinted at betrayal. Old flames appeared in the tabloids, offering stories designed to humiliate. The pressure reached its breaking point during a critical merger deal. Billions were at stake. His team urged him to distance himself from Elena, at least publicly, until the deal was secured. "She's a distraction," they told him. "Walk away now or lose everything." That night, Lennox found himself standing outside Elena's apartment, staring at the door, torn between two worlds. Inside was the woman who made him feel alive, who reminded him he wasn't too broken to be chosen. But outside stood the empire he had built, the life he had carved from stone and fire, the identity that had defined him for so long. When she opened the door, her smile was gentle, unassuming. She let him in, and they sat at the small wooden table where she graded assignments by lamplight. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of a man unraveling, he admitted, "They want me to let you go. They say you're costing me everything." Elena listened quietly, her hands folded on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "And what do you say?" He closed his eyes. "Torn, I don't know. I've fought my whole life to build this, and now, with you, I feel like I'm fighting myself." I don't know if I can have both." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Lennox, if you see me as something you have to choose instead of someone who walks beside you, then you'll lose me anyway. I won't compete with your empire. I'm not here to take it away, but I also can't live in a place where I'm seen as the enemy of your success." Her words cut clean through the fog. She wasn't asking him to abandon his world. She was asking him to redefine it, to stop living like his empire was his identity and start seeing it as only part of who he was. The hook of that moment was brutal. For the first time in his life, he realized that love was not about possession, but about transformation. It wasn't about adding another trophy to his name, it was about allowing himself to be remade. In the days that followed, Lennox faced choices that would have once been unthinkable. He began to say no to meetings that compromised his peace. He refused interviews that reduced Elena to a headline. And when the merger deal came to the final hour, with board members pressuring him to end his relationship to secure their trust, he did something that shocked them all. He stood in the conference room, looked them in the eye, and said, "If you can't trust me because of the woman I love, then you don't belong at my table." The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Some investors walked away. The deal nearly collapsed. His advisors warned him that his empire would suffer. But Lennox walked out of that room lighter than he had in years, because for once, his choice wasn't about money. It was about truth. That evening, he returned to Elena with a weariness that felt strangely close to peace. She opened the door to find him standing there with nothing to prove, no armor, no mask. Just a man stripped bare of the world's applause. "I chose you," he said simply. Elena looked at him, her eyes soft with something he couldn't name. "You didn't choose me, Lennox. You chose yourself. You chose to stop being who the world demanded and start being who you were meant to be." Her words were a revelation, a mirror turned back on him. For years, he had been a phantom myth, unreachable, untouchable, unsatisfied. Now, for the first time, he felt like a man who could finally rest. But the storm wasn't over. Choices always carry consequences, and as Lennox stood there, feeling the fragile peace of a new beginning, he had no idea that forces in the shadows, envious rivals, betrayed allies, even ghosts of his past were already moving against him. Love had given him courage, but courage would soon demand a price. And the question lingered like thunder on the horizon. Would he be strong enough to pay it? The peace Lennox had begun to taste was fragile, almost too fragile, like glass that shimmered beautifully, but could shatter with the slightest pressure. For weeks, he walked in that delicate balance, choosing Elena over the noise, choosing stillness over the endless chase. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt he was living for more than survival or conquest. He was living for meaning. But the world he had built did not forgive so easily. It began with whispers, subtle betrayals that spread like smoke. Investors who once praised him now questioned his leadership. Newspapers that once glorified his empire now hinted at weakness. Rivals circled like wolves, sensing blood. For them, it wasn't about Elena herself. It was about what she represented. To them, she was vulnerability made visible, proof that the untouchable titan could be touched. One evening, as Lennox sat in his penthouse looking over contracts, his oldest confidant, Marcus, came to him with a grim expression. Marcus had been by his side from the beginning, helping him turn dreams into steel and glass. But tonight, his eyes carried the weight of betrayal. "You need to wake up, Lennox," Marcus said. "They're pulling out. Half the board is already siding with your competitors. If you don't end this, you'll lose everything." The words landed like a blade. For a long time, Lennox didn't respond. He stared out at the skyline, the glittering city he had conquered. And for a moment, the old fear returned. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of being nothing without the empire. But then, in the silence, he remembered Elena's voice. "If you see me as something you have to choose instead of someone who walks beside you, then you'll lose me anyway." When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Maybe I've been holding on to everything that doesn't matter, Marcus. If they walk away, let them. I'm not losing her." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. But deep down, Lennox knew this wasn't weakness, it was strength. For the first time, He wasn't bending to the world's demands. He was standing in his own truth. Still, truth does not erase consequences. Days later, news broke of a failed acquisition, one that sent Vail Global's stock tumbling. Reporters swarmed his offices, asking if love had clouded his judgment. Headlines screamed of the billionaire falling from his throne. And in the middle of it all, Elena's name was dragged through the mud. She was called a distraction, an intruder, even a curse. Lennox tried to shield her, but he couldn't silence the world. And one night, when he came to see her, he found her sitting by her window, tears on her face though she tried to hide them. "Tell me this isn't my fault," she whispered. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his. "This is not your fault. They're afraid, Elena, afraid of change, afraid of anything they can't control. But I'm not afraid of losing them. I'm afraid of losing you." Her eyes searched his, filled with both love and sorrow. "I can endure their words, Lennox, but what I can't endure is watching you be torn apart. If I'm the reason they're destroying you—" Her voice broke before she could finish. He silenced her with a firmness that carried no doubt. "You are not the reason I'm breaking. You are the reason I'm still standing. For a long time." They held each other in that silence, the city's noise fading into nothing. But even as he comforted her, Lennox knew the war was only beginning. His rivals wouldn't stop, the board wouldn't forgive. And somewhere inside him, a fear whispered that love alone might not be enough to withstand what was coming. The storm hit with full force when Marcus's trusted ally betrayed him. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, hidden in contracts, buried in board votes. Until one day Lennox discovered that Marcus had aligned with his fiercest competitor. The man he had trusted most was now the man leading the charge to take everything away. When the truth came out, Lennox felt the kind of pain he hadn't known since his childhood. When the people he relied on most had abandoned him, betrayal cut deeper than failure ever could. He tried to mask it, to carry on as though he wasn't bleeding inside, but Elena saw it instantly. She always did. One night, she came to him when the weight of it all seemed too heavy to bear. He was sitting alone in the dark, the city lights flickering across his face, without a word. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone," she whispered. Her presence was the balm his wounds couldn't find elsewhere. He had been betrayed by the world, but in her, he found loyalty that asked for nothing, expected nothing, needed nothing but truth. The hook of this chapter wasn't the betrayal or the loss, it was the choice Lennox now faced. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting for his empire. He was fighting for his soul. Would he descend into anger, vengeance, the old ways of power and ruthlessness? Or would he rise into something new, something stronger, something that love had begun to awaken in him? The city was watching. His rivals were circling. His empire was crumbling. But none of that terrified him as much as the thought of losing the woman who had reminded him. He was never too broken to be chosen. As he looked at Elena that night, he realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about redemption, about becoming the man he was always meant to be. And though the storm raged louder than ever, he whispered words into the quiet, words she would carry with her forever. "They can take everything from me, Elena, but as long as I have you, I still have everything." The battle wasn't over. In fact, the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time, Lennox Vail was ready not to conquer the world, but to be conquered by something far greater. And that something was love. The days that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Every step Lennox took seemed to send stones tumbling into the abyss below. The empire he had built, the name he had protected, the legacy he thought would define him, it was all trembling under the weight of betrayal and doubt. Yet for the first time, he no longer feared the fall. What he feared was losing the one steady presence that had taught him he was more than what he owned. Elena stood by him in silence when the noise grew unbearable. She didn't try to fix the battles he faced, didn't try to shield him with empty reassurances. Instead, she gave him something far rarer, the courage to face himself. She reminded him that his worth wasn't tied to numbers on a balance sheet or headlines in a newspaper. It was tied to the choices he made when everything else was stripped away. One evening, when the city was drowned in rain, Lennox asked her the question that had haunted him since the beginning. Why me, out of all the people in the world? Why would you choose someone like me? Her answer was quiet, but unshakable. Because I never saw what the world saw. They saw the walls you built. I saw the man behind them, the man who wanted to be free, and I chose him. Those words pierced through every layer of doubt that had chained him for years. For the first time in his life, Lennox Vale believed he was worthy of being chosen, not for what he had, but for who he was becoming. But the storm was not finished testing him. Days later, Marcus and the rival company moved to strip him of control. In a brutal meeting, board members voted against him, handing over the crown of Vale Global to the very man who had betrayed him. For many, it was the end of his reign, the fall of the Titan. Lennox walked out of that boardroom with nothing but silence around him. Reporters shouted his name, demanding comment. Cameras flashed like lightning, but he said nothing. He simply walked away, not as the billionaire the world once feared, but as a man who had finally laid down the weight of trying to be untouchable. When he arrived at Elena's side, she looked at him not with pity, but with pride. So what now? She asked. Lennox's answer carried no hesitation. Now I begin again, not to prove anything, not to chase what never mattered, but to build something real. And he did, slowly, quietly. He began to use what remained of his wealth and influence to create something entirely different. Instead of towers of glass and steel, he built schools, community centers, programs for those who had no voice. He poured himself into work that healed instead of consumed. And though the world called it a fall from grace, for Lennox it was the first time he had ever felt like he was truly rising. Through it all, Elena remained by his side, not as an ornament, not as a shadow, but as an equal. She continued her studies, her teaching, her quiet pursuit of touching lives one heart at a time. And together, they discovered that love was not about grand gestures or headlines. It was about small, steady moments, shared laughter in the middle of storms, long walks without words, the peace of knowing you are no longer alone in the fight. The hook of this final chapter was not in his loss, but in his victory. The world thought he had been stripped of everything, but in reality, he had been freed from everything that had once chained him. For the first time, Lennox Vale had nothing to prove and everything to give. Years later, when people spoke his name, they no longer spoke of the billionaire who could not be satisfied. They spoke of the man who chose love over empire, who turned betrayal into redemption, who discovered that the greatest wealth a person could ever hold was a heart that finally knew peace. And when he stood beside Elena, watching children play in the schools he had built, he realized that this quiet legacy of love and healing was worth more than all the towers he had ever raised. In the end, the man who had once been a phantom myth, feared and admired but never truly known, became something far greater, a man remembered not for the empire he built, but for the love that transformed him. Because sometimes, the most powerful story is not about conquering the world, it is about conquering yourself. And in that truth, Lennox Vale finally found everything he had been searching for.